Megan, thanks so much for being with us here. Can you tell us about the Indigenous Youth Reconciliation Barometer and why it's so critical to hear from the youth?
Of course, yeah. So the Indigenous Youth Reconciliation Barometer is one of the largest youth-focused research projects to date. So it's really a comprehensive look at how Indigenous youth envision their futures and what they're ready to leave in the past. So we engaged with 1,125 Indigenous youth from coast to coast to coast and really listened to youth express that they require systemic policy change and advocacy that promotes healing and wellness within their communities. And essentially it was a project that came from youth telling us that they were kind of looking to define their futures and share it with a wider audience and ready for us to support them in advocating for that change.
Aside from that, I guess, what were some of the things that stuck out from for you from what the youth had to say?
Yeah, there was so much. So one of the things that always comes to mind is across the many conversations that we had with youth, a lot of them are still quite committed to believing that reconciliation is really important. However, we compared a stat from 2019 when the first barometer happened, and at that time, about 75% of youth, of Indigenous youth participated, felt that reconciliation was possible, and there was actually quite a significant decrease this time to about 50%. And despite youth believing that reconciliation is important, we kind of noticed that youth are leaning much more heavily on their communities, and they're not waiting any longer for others to catch up. They're ready to kind of push forward and advocate for that change themselves.
Was there anything that was sticking out in terms of why the numbers there on reconciliation dropped so much?
I think a lot of youth really spoke to the fact that across their generations in their communities, their families, their parents, their elders, chiefs, and communities have been saying the same thing for decades. They already know what the solutions are. Communities know what they need best. And they're tired of kind of waiting for action to be taken by governments. And so youth are really seeing that advocacy work really increase in their communities, and they're really dedicating that time to connecting with each other. The networks that youth are building across communities, across nations, from coast to coast, is really something that we saw come through across all themes that we spoke to.
You know, I guess if the youth know what needs to happen, what are some of the barriers they're facing in trying to achieve their goals?
Yeah, it's a great question. When we spoke to a lot of youth, there were most of the barriers, of course, that we heard were as a result of colonization. I'm sure nobody's surprised by that. A lot of youth spoke to, I'll just reference the theme of education and meaningful work, a lack of access to education in particular, youth having to leave their communities when they don't want to. I think that's an important kind of context piece. Not enough funding for education, workplaces not being flexible enough for them to still support their communities or access culture, language and wellness, when we're talking about those themes, not having a way to start learning language in particular if they've had to leave their communities. So there's a lot of those particular examples that are really like embedded in communities, and youth are trying to find ways to connect with elders and folks who are doing that work and have been doing that work in order to kind of reach those futures that they spoke to so clearly and so eloquently throughout the report.
As you mentioned, Megan, there was a youth barometer back in 2019. A lot's gone on since then, a whole global pandemic for one. Were there any other major changes in how the youth were feeling aside from their thoughts on reconciliation?
Mm-hmm. Another important kind of change that we saw that was really meaningful, and again, I think speaks to that important connection to culture, was language. More youth are interested and committed to learning their language, so there was quite an increase in youth interested and committed to learning their language, and that's kind of across the board. Obviously, when you get more specific into which youth we spoke to, that does shift a little bit, but we're seeing more youth connected to that. In addition, mention something that was also really interesting is back in 2019, one of the key motivators for Indigenous youth was financial gain and financial kind of comfort and sustainability. And this time around, it was more about supporting family and community. And again, I think that speaks to the fact that youth are seeing that the people that have their backs the most are their families, their community, and their networks. And all of those other things that are important, comfort, basic needs, financial gain, are still there. But in order to achieve those, the people that we're leaning on the most and that we saw across all of those conversations really are community, because those are the folks that are kind of always going to be there and have our backs no matter what those kind of barriers are.
I guess just quickly here, Megan, this was a pretty large sample size of opinions. How do you turn it into policies and programs and change mindsets to help the youth achieve these goals?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the most important things for us is that we really wanted this research to not just sit on a shelf. So if you read the report, you'll notice it's quite long. It's about 194 pages, and we didn't want the data to just be numbers. So you'll see the stories shared, and that's something that's really connected to Indigenous communities, is telling those stories, because the numbers are actually people. We talked to these youth over the past year and a half, and so part of what we're hoping when we talk to folks like yourself and we talk to governments who are hopefully going to hear these stories and want to make a change is that they see that those numbers and these statistics are actually connected to people. And so when you hear the recommendations that we made in the report, and also the more specific sector-specific recommendations we're going to be creating as well, that you're actually going to be impacting and changing real lives. And we have a really strong responsibility to the youth to continue to carry forward this work. So it doesn't stop here. The report's finished, but we have a lot of work to continue to do alongside youth to ensure that we are honoring their voices and honoring the change that we hope to see, and that they're already doing such strong leadership to make sure it takes place.
Well, good stuff, Megan. Good work. Appreciate you taking some time to talk to us about it here today.
Yeah, thank you so much.